Well, the breaking news of the night is that Donald Trump has lost another very important vote. That makes 2 nights in a row of breaking news about Donald Trump being on the losing side of a very important vote. Last night, the voters of Wisconsin crushed Donald Trump and Elon Musk's candidate for a state Supreme Court justice, and instead elected the candidate supported by the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, Susan Crawford, to be the next elected Supreme Court justice in the state of Wisconsin. But tonight, the Republican-controlled United States Senate made history by voting against Donald Trump for the first time. Donald Trump lost the vote in the United States Senate tonight. 4 Republican senators joined all the Democrats in voting against Donald Trump tonight in the United States Senate, 51-48, in favor of a resolution that would nullify any claim of presidential authority to impose tariffs on Canada. This is the first big crack in the wall of Republican senatorial support for Donald Trump. Republicans voting against the Trump-Canadian tariffs in the Senate were Senator Mitch McConnell, Senator Susan Collins, Senator Lisa Murkowski, and Senator Rand Paul. Donald Trump began his day with a social media post attacking those 4 senators, and still they defied Donald Trump. Rand Paul said as clearly as I have been saying for years the truth that other Republicans dare not say, that tariffs are taxes on the American people.
Tariffs are a terrible mistake. They don't work. They will lead to higher prices. They are a tax, and they have historically been bad for our economy.
Donald Trump's secret is out. Tariffs are a tax on American consumers only. Foreign countries don't pay those taxes. Trump supporters wouldn't believe me when I was telling them that for years, but now Republicans are saying it loud and saying it clear. Mitch McConnell said it today. Now the financial networks like CNBC are saying it constantly. And tonight, the Wall Street Journal, in its editorial in response to Donald Trump's announcement of the new tariffs today, said tariffs are taxes, pure and simple. Back in the 20th century, a nerdy right-wing Republican in Washington who never held elected office, named Grover Norquist, bent the entire Republican Party in Washington to his will. It was pathetic to watch. In effect, he forced them to sign a pledge to never vote for an increase in taxes of any kind. And every single Republican member of the United States Senate signed where Grover Norquist ordered them to sign. Every Republican presidential candidate signed where Grover Norquist required them to sign in order to be Republican candidates. And almost every Republican member of the House of Representatives signed exactly where Grover Norquist ordered them to sign, to never, ever, ever support an increase in taxation of any form. Republicans lived in fear of this guy, that guy right there in the middle. At the time, I declared Grover Norquist to be the most powerful unelected person in Washington because on one issue anyway, he had complete control over one of our political parties. Former Republican presidential campaign manager, my friend Stuart Stevens, wrote a book about the Grover Norquist-controlled Republican Party after Donald Trump was elected president, and he titled that book, "It Was All a Lie." It turns out Grover Norquist was and is a lie. Grover Norquist has revealed himself not to be a principled anti-tax crusader, as has every Republican member of the Senate and House of Representatives, because at some point, every single one of them has supported Donald Trump's increase in taxation on Americans through tariffs, which are sales taxes administered only on goods imported into this country and paid only by Americans in this country. Every one of those Republicans has either actively supported those taxes by Donald Trump or held their cowardly silence about them. And Grover Norquist, the nerd who was once perceived as the toughest Republican operative in Washington, is hiding tonight in his permanent cocoon of cowardly silence about Donald Trump's sales taxes Donald Trump's tariffs. The last time the gasoline tax was increased in the United States of America was 32 years ago, with only Democratic votes in the House and the Senate. And Grover Norquist was outraged that Democrats, and Democrats only, voted to increase the gasoline tax in America. In 1993, the Democrats voted to increase the gasoline tax by 4.3 cents. And Grover Norquist screamed at the top of his histrionic anti-tax lungs about what a horrible burden an additional 4.3 cents a gallon of gasoline would be in America, what burden it would be for American drivers. And I'll never forget that outrage about the 4.3 cent increase in the gasoline tax, because I was working in the United States Senate at the time as the chief of staff of the Senate Finance Committee, and I personally negotiated that number, 4.3 cents, with the staff of a Democratic senator who was the final holdout on the gas tax increase, the final vote that we needed to get it through the committee. We actually started off by trying to increase it by a dime, but in the desperate last-minute negotiations to get that final vote in the Senate Finance Committee, the most I could get was 4.3 cents, which at the time was roughly a 2% increase in the cost of a gallon of gasoline, 2%. And Grover Norquist went crazy. And every Republican in the Senate and the House, including Mitch McConnell then in the Senate, claimed that the Democrats were crushing the American consumer with that increase in the gasoline tax, 4.3 cents. Newt Gingrich used it in his insurgent campaign to win control of the House of Representatives for Republicans in the next election for the first time in 40 years. And tonight, Newt Gingrich supports 54% sales taxes that Donald Trump is imposing, and 25% sales taxes that Donald Trump is imposing, and 10% sales taxes that Donald Trump is imposing on everything the United States of America imports from anywhere in the world. That 4.3 cent increase in the gasoline tax in 1993 was part of a complex deficit reduction legislation bill, huge bill, signed by President Clinton that included spending cuts and tax increases aimed at reducing the deficit, which is exactly what it successfully did. It was at the time the biggest tax increase in history, but that record has been broken. Broken by Donald Trump. Republican Mike Pence, who signed Grover Norquist's anti-tax pledge in order to win his seat in the House of Representatives, tweeted tonight, the Trump tariff tax is the largest peacetime tax hike in U.S. history. These tariffs are nearly 10 times the size of those imposed during the Trump-Pence administration and will cost American families over $3,500 per year. And so tonight, we have a new winner for biggest tax increase in history, Donald Trump and his faithful and mostly cowardly supporters in Congress. As I said, Donald Trump attacked the 4 senators who voted against him tonight in a social media post this morning, saying Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and Rand Paul, also of Kentucky, will hopefully get on the Republican bandwagon for a change and fight the Democrats' wild and flagrant push to not penalize Canada. To the people of the great states of Kentucky, Alaska, and Maine, please contact these senators and get them to finally adhere to Republican values and ideals. Senator Collins explained on the Senate floor why the people of Maine did not burn up her office telephones today, demanding a trade war with Canada. Donald Trump, of course, wouldn't have understood everything she said because he, of course, has no idea which country Prince Edward Island is in.
For example, many Maine blueberries are processed in Prince Edward Island. Maine also sends between $200 million and $400 million worth of lobster to Canada each year for processing. There are 240 lobster processing plants in Canada, but only 15 in the United States. I share the president's goal of getting more of that manufacturing done in the state of Maine, done in the United States. But the fact is that if we impose these tariffs on Canadian processing, it's going to be our Maine lobstermen who will bear the cost. It's going to be consumers who bear the cost. The price hikes that will happen for Maine families, every time they go to the grocery store, they fill their gas tank, they fill their heating oil tank. If these tariffs go into effect, will be so harmful. And as price hikes always do, they will hurt those the most who can afford them the least.
The people who can afford them the least. Grover Norquist doesn't care about those people. He never has. Donald Trump doesn't care about those people. He never has, never will. 48 Republican senators do not care about those people. And no Republican members of the House of Representatives care about those people. Not one of them. Everyone who pulls up lobster pots in Maine for a living knows something else Donald Trump doesn't know, which is the biggest foreign customer in the world for Maine lobster is China. And so the people of Maine did not demand that Susan Collins get in line with the madman who wants a trade war with Canada and the world. In the country where Rand Paul grew up and where I grew up and where you grew up, presidents didn't control tariffs. Congress did. A couple of obscure laws passed by Congress decades ago gave the president power to adjust tariffs only in a national emergency, which basically meant something like a world war. Donald Trump's claim of emergency conditions as the legal justification of his tariff orders today is provably false, especially when it comes to as good a neighboring country that exists in the world, Canada. The vote in the Senate was to remove the president's power to declare an emergency involving Canada.
Taxes should not be enacted by one person. So I will vote today to end the emergency. I will vote today to try to reclaim the power of taxation, the power of the tariff, to where the Constitution designated it should properly be, and that is in Congress.
While the Senate was voting tonight against Donald Trump, after-hours trading showed a stock market crash in the making, which will leave Wall Street in fear of tomorrow morning's opening bell. Donald Trump didn't want to see an active, ongoing stock market crash during his announcement today, so he made his announcement after the markets closed on Wall Street. Even before he spoke today, the Wall Street Journal called Donald Trump's plan, quote, the dumbest trade war in history. And after Donald Trump revealed his biggest tax increase in history today, the Wall Street Journal said, quote, tariffs are taxes. Donald Trump's years of lying about foreign countries paying Donald Trump's tariffs have crashed into the brick wall of reality. No foreign country has ever paid a tariff imposed by the United States of America. No country on earth is empowered in any way to impose taxes of any kind on another country. Everyone knows that, except Donald Trump and the supporters who he fooled. The Wall Street Journal said, tariffs are taxes. Car prices will rise by thousands of dollars, including those made in America. In the demented rhetoric unique to Donald Trump, he decided to call today Liberation Day. And it turned out he was right. It was Liberation Day for 4 Republican United States senators who finally summoned the strength to vote against Donald Trump and defeat him in the United States Senate.